All right. So if you have any questions as we go through today's presentation, please feel free to either drop them in the chat box. We will be monitoring that the entire time today. Or if you'd like to use under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, there's an option to raise your hand. Feel free to do that as well if you'd like to ask your question verbally. As always, we will be sending out a follow-up email from today's session. Today's email will be a little bit longer. We're going to include a couple of videos for you. We've also got our key takeaways from today's session, just like we always do. So of course, make sure that if you want to provide your email address or another email address than what you registered with, please make sure that we have that so you get that follow-up email. So with that, we are going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to share our slide deck here. And in the meantime, Elizabeth and Max, if you want to just remind everybody who you are.
Sure, absolutely. So, hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Cipolla. And for those of you who are able to join us for last week's session, you should see me as a familiar face. I'm actually the practice leader of Decision Associates here based out of Erie, Pennsylvania, but we service clients all throughout the United States and beyond. I have been with Decision Associates about 5 years. And the topic that we're here talking about today is something that is near and dear to my heart and something that I have committed the past 25 years of my career to really, perfecting and doing my best to continually improve. So welcome.
And I'm Max Krug, so welcome everyone. My company, Future State Engineering, I'm the owner of that. I've been doing this for a long time, 35 years, 38 years, something like that. And I work with companies to help them improve their operational performance. And I'm happy to partner with Decision Associates because culture is a huge, important part of a transformational change. So that's why we are doing this series. And welcome everyone.
Great, thank you. And I'm Amanda Kacherka. I'm also part of the Decision Associates team, been on the team for about 2.5 years. And so this, especially the culture side that Elizabeth and I are talking about is something that I've really grown to love with the time that I've been at Decision Associates, especially once I've seen the impact that it can have on organizations that we work with. So excited to have you all here. And with that, we are going to dive in. All right. So what are we covering today? We're going to talk a little bit about measuring change. So the last 2 sessions that we've gone through, we've shared, from an operational standpoint, from a culture standpoint, some tips and tricks for how you go about making change effectively within your organization. But one of the things that we see regularly is, well, we're making all these changes. How do we know if they're working? How do we track what we're doing? And so we're going to talk about that today. So we're talking about measuring change, why it's important, why it matters. And then Max is going to talk a little bit about operational leading indicators. Elizabeth and I are going to talk through some cultural leading indicators. And then we're going to talk about why nobody can do this alone. This is definitely, making changes anytime you do that to your operations, to your culture. It's not something you can do on an island. You need a good team around you. You need good resources, good support partners. And so we're going to talk through that as well. And then, as always, we're going to give you some next steps, which will lead very nicely into the follow-up email from today's session. So first and foremost, measuring change, a great quote to start us off here. Without measurement, we don't know if there is an improvement. We don't know what is meaningful. And so that's a lot of times when organizations are making change, it's what's the impact? How meaningful is this for our organization? How do we make sure that we're tracking that? What's the best way to do that? And so that's what we're talking through today.
Excellent. So thank you so much, Amanda. I just wanted to remind everyone of something really important when it comes to measuring change. First and foremost, before we even discuss what you see in front of you on this particular slide, I want to just point something out that I'd say, and Max, I'm curious if you see the same thing, that I would say the majority of clients with whom we've worked who have been disappointed with the change they've been trying to implement have measured. And here's what it is. Tell me if this sounds familiar. a lot of times organizational leaders, when they are excited to introduce a change, whether it be a change to operational processes or a change to, really, let's say service areas that they really focus upon, whatever change it may be, a lot of times we see clients measure the change based upon when the change took place. In other words, well, this particular operational change goes into effect on November 1st. So I'm going to measure whether or not that change was successful based upon how many people complain about it, how many people are just doing what we told them they need to do as of November 1st. But really, there's so much more that goes into measuring change. It's not digital. It's not quite literally like a light switch. In order for something to change, there needs to be a loss. And I think that's something that is extremely important for us to start out reminding ourselves when we embark upon talking about what Max and I have prepared for you today. So, as with anything, if you think of anything at all that has changed in your lives, even think about your personal lives, there has to be a loss. Something has to change and be different and no longer occur in order for something new to take place. So, whenever something goes away, there's a grieving process. And I like to point out that this grieving process is really known as the curve of change. And really, that's what I want to get everybody's minds wrapped around when it comes to measuring change. As Amanda said, Max and I are going to give you some indicators as it relates to how to go about measuring change, both on the operational side as well as on the organizational culture side. But what we really want to make sure you understand is that it's going to impact every single person. And there are 4 particular stages that are going to be prevalent for any organization, for any group of people, as it pertains to that change curve. So really measuring the change, as you see in the box on the bottom, that's going to help you to predict exactly how people will react to change so you can support them through that transition instead of misreading the inevitable reactions that are going to occur because there's a loss as a failed change, because that is not the case.
So I'll make
So
a quick comment there. So one of
yeah,
the guys that trained me, he said, in order to do a change, you got to do something different. So you got to do something different, but also more importantly, you got to stop doing what you did before. If you don't stop what you did before, you're not going to have the sustainable change. And I think that's that loss that Elizabeth is talking about.
Yes. Good ad, Max. Thank you for saying that. And that's actually a perfect segue to kind of talk through really quickly the graphic that you see on your screen right now. So remember I had mentioned that there are 4 stages of change, and really that change curve is something that is really fundamental for everyone who's participating in today's webinar to understand. So just like Max stated, initially, when you hear of a change, there's going to be that semblance of shock, right? And then inevitably after that shock, there's going to be an anger or a mourning for what once was, right? Well, why do we have to do this? I'm so used to doing it thus and such way. And so what's going to happen is, that support, the behaviors that you want to see occur as a result of that change, it's going to actually take a dip downward. But then as you see, if you don't give up and misread that inevitable anger that's going to occur for the change curve, if you don't misread that and give up and say, oh, it failed, and then change course, you're going to understand that then once they go through that process, there's going to be an incline on that change curve, and they're going to really start working towards acceptance and then ultimately commitment. So once again, really understanding that natural process that will occur for any change you're trying to implement, it's going to help prevent you from giving up prematurely and mislabeling it as a failed change, which, by the way, I'd be curious if any of you want to unmute yourselves and share, or maybe even drop a comment in the comment box or in the chat box. What have you seen occur when you've worked with leaders who have prematurely given up on change, only because they didn't understand the acceptance and commitment that would be coming after it. So, what are some negative consequences you have seen or you have experienced or witnessed when a leader prematurely gives up on change, when they recognize the inevitable shock and anger that their team is going to experience? What are some things that you've seen as a consequence of that? And Max, maybe, or even Amanda, maybe even the two of you have something you could share as an example of what you've seen as a negative consequence of a leader who prematurely gives up on change and mislabels it as a failed change because they misread the shock and anger stage.
I've been in situations where it then turns into a blame game of, well, you're the reason why this didn't work, or this team is the reason why it didn't work. And so instead of, acknowledging the fact that, oh, maybe we just didn't give it a long enough time to take effect and to allow everyone to process what was happening, it's, shifted into pointing fingers and, just a really unfriendly and unwelcoming environment. And so it just really doesn't make you interested in trying to go through a change again in the future if that's what it's going to result in.
Absolutely. And like Amy stated in the chat box, it causes a loss of trust in the leader who was attempting to implement the change, right? Because why? They're changing course or changing direction, and they're not really demonstrating through their behaviors that they're there and prepared to be there to walk alongside their team to help them through that change curve. Max, what about you?
Yeah, so I like this curve because I would assume that the more difficult to change, that timeline that you have on the bottom is going to vary, right? So it's like the more difficult to change, that timeline is going to vary. And what I see is that leaders fail too early.
Mm-hmm.
It's a commitment. That commitment we talked about in my session is so important, and they got to stay the course and they can't bail. They
Mm-hmm.
got to be committed to that. It's going to be a difficult ride, and I think bailing out too early is what I see leaders do.
Right. Absolutely. And then, like Austin stated, Max, when you bail out too early, then that leader who is attempting to implement change is labeled as, oh, this is a flavor of the month kind of person, right? And then no one takes anything they say seriously when they're attempting to implement change. So let's help you understand the different stages in that grieving process, that change transition grieving process. So the first stage is shock. And I think that's something that everyone can relate to. Shock is when you think to yourself, oh no, this can't be, or there's got to be a different way we can do this. I'm thinking of a difficult conversation I had with a particular individual on Monday morning, as a matter of fact, and they were demonstrating these stages. And right out of the gate, they said, no, there's got to be another way. Let's figure out a different way. There's got to be a different way. We can't do this. So instead of arguing with that person, or instead of, taking offense to that and responding emotionally, I walked alongside them and asked them some questions to help them get their heads wrapped around, the reality of the situation. So, stage one shock, that's always going to take place. That's always going to happen. Amanda, what are some behaviors that you think, leaders should look for when it comes to, if they have employees who don't verbalize the shock or denial they're feeling, what are some behaviors that would be an indication they're experiencing those emotions?
Yeah, I think a lot of times it's an avoidance situation where, it's they're not bringing it up, they're not mentioning it, they're definitely, not actually exhibiting the change. So
Mhm.
it's kind of I'm just going to shove this under the rug and pretend like I didn't hear about it and move on with my day.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's also, they may not necessarily be verbalizing that shock to you as the leader, but they may be verbalizing it to other people on the team,
Mhm.
or even people outside of the organization. We hope they don't do that, but that does happen sometimes. So those are probably the two that we see most frequently.
Absolutely. And Max, stage two anger, I would imagine from the work that you've been doing for many years with helping organizations with operational improvements, you have seen many examples of employees resisting that change, right? And I'd say stage 2 anger is the one that has the greatest risk of leaders prematurely bailing out, right? So the anger stage, just to help you understand it, they're afraid. Anger that is being verbalized or demonstrated through behaviors is rooted in fear, right? So what I want to caution everybody about is if you are not prepared to walk alongside your people and provide the supports necessary and really, do what is necessary to help them process and work through this stage, the change that you're attempting to implement will never work. So they need help. And help does not come in the way of suck it up. No one wants to hear it, right? That's not the help we're talking about. Max, maybe you could share from your perspective just a low-hanging fruit of a simple behavior or simple way of helping that leaders that you work with could demonstrate to help the people you work with to move out of stage 2.
Yeah, so to me, it's a lot of coaching.
Mhm.
So you're going to have people that they'll say yes in the meetings, and then the behavior will be different outside the meetings. And they're just like, this will never work. And it's like, they're not on board. And so the leaders need to recognize that and find those people and coach them, because, that one bad apple can get a lot of people going in the wrong direction. So and I always try to find those, influencers in the company and make sure we got those people on board. So you need those internal advocates. So it's having those internal advocates that are on board, that are the influencers. And also when you see the people not taking the right actions and they're, say yes in the meetings and do something different, they need to be identified and coached. And, it's not beating them right in this submission. It's coaching them so that they get on board.
Mhm. And the behavior that Max just described is something that we all have heard of. And probably everyone in this webinar has done a time or two because we're human beings. And that would be saying one thing, doing another. That is known as passive aggressive behavior. So I'm actually going to ask Amanda to share with everybody as one of the items that she shares as a follow-up, a quick little read article of practical things you can do to address passive aggressive behavior in a healthy way in the workplace. And just remember to associate that with what you can do to help people through this stage 2 of anger. So after anger, the good news is there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and that light at the end of the tunnel is known as stage 3 acceptance. Now, if you can help them through stage 2, now they're going to begin to focus less and less on what they've lost and begin to open themselves up to accepting what is to come. And another thing I want to caution everybody about for this stage, inevitably, they're going to test and explore what the changes mean to them. So this is where you're going to need to make sure that you have put ample thought in advance into what boundaries are negotiable and what boundaries are non-negotiable. Everybody here has human beings working at their organization. Everybody here is a part of this webinar series because they want to make sure that they can positively implement change, right? So just understand that they're going to inevitably test and see how much can we really stick with that we've been doing before, and how much are they really going to reinforce that we do differently. So again, I don't want you as a leader to throw in the towel and think, oh, because they're testing the boundaries, that means it's a failed change. No, this is something to expect. This is something to anticipate. And this is something for you to proactively prepare for when it comes to understanding what stage 3 acceptance is all about. They're going to test and explore what it means to them.
I want to just share something Alejandro shared in the chat.
Yeah.
He said, people don't want to lose the positive that they already have, so they ignore a proposed change if it's not viewed as an improvement. And we definitely see that all the time. If you've got a group of folks in your organization who say, no, everything's perfect, we don't need to change. Why are we talking about changing things when everything's working just fine? This is great. It's working for us. And they may not be able to see that bigger picture and the improvement that will result as the change is implemented. So it's also part of the leadership's responsibility to really help the team understand the bigger picture, not just maybe that little piece of what the change is that they own, help them see what the bigger impact is and understand the overall improvement to the organization to help them process that change as well.
Right. And I think, Alejandro, that's a good point you make, because really acknowledging the way that they're feeling and understanding, yes, hey, we hear you, we understand the positives that you're worried are going to be lost, and not being overly rigid. That's why I said earlier, figure out those boundaries. What are the negotiables? What are the non-negotiables? And wherever you can introduce flexibility, I think it's important to do that. But you can't just do it on a whim, right? You want to make sure that you, before you even roll out the change, you understand what's negotiable, what's not, so that they can do whatever they can do to hold on to the nuggets of it that aren't going to adversely affect the change that you're trying to implement. And also you're showing that you care and you're respectful of their experience going through it. So the last stage that I want to talk about is commitment. And of course, this is the one that every leader expects is going to happen the moment that a change is announced. But we now know that that is not possible. So for stage 4 commitment, this is where not only have they accepted it's going to happen, but they show through the behaviors they demonstrate, through the words that they speak, through the consistency of the words and the behaviors, versus what Max shared earlier, when the words and the behaviors don't jive. They're demonstrating that they've embraced the change. In addition to that, they are actively restructuring how they work so that they can be as, positive and productive to helping that change to be implemented. So that is the 4th and final stage of the change grieving process. We're going to talk a little bit now about some of the common mistakes that we see when it comes to measuring change. Amanda, did you want to speak a little bit about this?
Sure. So we see a few different common mistakes as we work with organizations that are trying to implement change. First of those is they're only measuring the activities of the change. So they're making a change and they're only looking at the things that are immediately impacted by that change. And that's all they're tracking. And so, yeah, that's part of it. That's a good place to start. But remember, that's only a very small piece of the bigger picture. Also, failing to measure the quality of the change. So looking at, what are the impacts that are being made on the quality of what's being done? Whether that's adapting your processes, results that you're seeing, other changes that you're seeing within the teams. Tracking the quality, the impact that has is incredibly important.
Max, is there anything you wanted to add as it pertains to failing to measure the quality of change from what you've seen?
Yeah, so I'm promoting a lot of system thinking. So what Amanda was saying, it's like, yes, that change that we're measuring in that specific area, that's only a piece of it. And we want to look at the overall picture and understand, like, how's that improving the organizational performance? How's that improving the culture of the organization? I think people lose sight of that because we're departmental focused and we're not company focused. So it's like, oh, it doesn't seem to be working. It's like, but if we look at the whole picture and the performance of the company is getting better, that's what we're really trying to achieve.
Excellent. Well said. So let's talk about a couple of additional common mistakes. And I'm curious if any of these sound familiar to you. I mean, we've already talked about the final thing you see on this slide, and that is mislabeling and prematurely mislabeling the change as failed at stage 2 and just throwing in the towel. But another one I want to talk about is, not setting realistic goals that align with the change curve. So it's important for you as an organizational leader who's influencing the way that change is rolled out. It's important for you to take what you've learned today to educate the other leaders that you have influence over, to realistically know what to expect in terms of the behaviors that they may see and the emotions that inevitably the people impacted by change are going to go through so that you can set targets that align with those 4 stages on the change curve that we just discussed. So once again, it's very important to set targets that are realistic with the 4 different stages on the change curve. The next thing that I want to talk about has to do with only measuring change at one level. So there are 3 different levels of change to make sure you're measuring. There's the individual, right? And that's based on quite literally the human beings that are being impacted by it. There's the levels to measure focus on the initiative itself. So what stages are we at? What stages have we progressed through, and how streamlined are those stages for the actual initiative? And then there's the organizational impact, right? So which stage, I'm just curious to ask the group, which level would you say many organizations focus too much on? And which level would you say organizations focus too little on when it comes to measuring change? So if you look at those 3 levels, individual, initiative, and organizational, which level do you feel organizations focus too much on in measuring change? And which do you feel organizations focus too little on? So Abigail, you mentioned individual. Would you say individual is what organizations focus too much on or too little on?
I was going to say too much on.
Okay. And
Yeah, go ahead.
why do you say that? I think you were about to say that.
Yeah. My experience in 2 organizational changes is there is a lot of sort of up down, you need to change your behavior, you need to change this, there's a cultural change. And there's a lot of sort of like get with the program kind of going on. And I'm not even sure how they're measuring the individual change, but it definitely seems to be staff focused or individual focused is my experience.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Abigail. Alejandro, Amanda, do you want to share what Alejandro said?
Sure. He said, the problem is that the local improvement is not always related with the global improvement measurement. It's a great point, Alejandro. ROI, cash flow, client base. Yes, definitely. Especially when you've got a global organization or even an organization that's maybe in the same country, but you've got multiple locations throughout that country. Anytime you're dealing with multiple locations, that's definitely something that can suffer. Is you've got different standards, different behaviors, different ways that change is being adapted across all locations, and there's no consistency.
I want to make a comment on that. So it's like,
Sure.
I see that people spend too much focus on the initiative itself and don't understand what the impact of that initiative is on the organization. And some companies I go into, they forget about the individual. It's like, just do it my way. Right?
Right. And by definition, individual, yes, can mean the actual human being as an individual person, but also for a larger, organization that has many, many different locations, individual can also have a dual meaning. It could be the individual locations in comparison to the overall organization. So yes, very good. Very
that
good.
actually feeds well into the comment that Chris made in the chat box, which is that it's easiest to measure the initiative, but that's probably the least important long term.
Yes, yes. Because if approaching it from an empathetic perspective, where you're proactively thinking about the individual impact and understanding those 4 stages that we already discussed, and really coming up with measurements that align with that, the initiative is going to be successful. That's going to naturally come. That's naturally going to come. So the next thing that I think is important for us to talk about is only using financial measures to guide the change process. Max, I know, have seen this happen a lot. So is there anything you would like to share as it pertains to that lag that inevitably happens?
Yeah, so sometimes we'll see it, sometimes we see the wrong measures and then the measures go the wrong way. So they're like, wait, this is supposed to be improving us, and the measurement's going the wrong way. And it's like, because the measurement that we're using is not correct.
Mhm.
And I think there's only just focusing on the financial year for getting the most important part, the customer.
Right. The customer, the client, who, whatever industry you're in, you're all there to serve, right? It doesn't matter what industry you're in. Every single person who works is in a relationship industry. So there's somebody that's being impacted, somebody you're serving. And you're exactly right, Max. We forget about that, right? If we're not intentional. So, let's go to the next slide. And one of the biggest mistakes is not even measuring it at all, or measuring the wrong things. We've already talked a lot about, measuring the wrong things, but I want to really put a, exclamation point next to what doesn't get measured won't get done. If you're not measuring it, it's nothing more than a hope and a wish, right? You have to be intentional. You have to be really strategic about connecting what it is your intentions are to the results that are taking place or not, so that you can tweak and finesse and know exactly what areas to hone in on to ensure that the change is going to be successful. So once again, it's in red, it's italicized. I wanted to jump off the screen at you. What doesn't get measured won't get done. And then last but not least, it is massively important and incredibly tempting not to ensure consistent feedback throughout all stages of the change curve. One thing, Amanda, I don't know if you want to speak to this. I think of the organizational change efforts that we work on together, specifically as it relates to cultural change, engagements that we help clients with. So often it's easy for leaders to want to bury their heads in the sand and not ask for feedback at the different stages of the change curve. Do you want to speak to that?
Yes. So we see this a lot. We spoke a little bit last week to our culture process. And so, communication usually in the early stages is pretty strong, pretty consistent, where we have, we're rolling out the survey. And then usually when we get the survey results back, and inevitably there are some things in there that maybe the leadership team is a little surprised by, and maybe their feelings get hurt a little bit, and they say, oh, this is an area I thought I was doing well in, and the employees are telling me that it's not. So then we start to see some of this kind of hiding in the bushes behavior, where it's like, well, if we don't talk about it, then it's not happening, it's not reality. And so they kind of close into themselves, and then the communication just kind of starts to trickle off. So that's when we have to come in and say, okay, look, we're going to work on this together. It's really important that you are communicative with your team so they understand, hey, we recognize there are areas that we do things really well in, and some areas where we need some work. And so we want to be open and honest about how we're addressing those all the way through the process, so everybody knows that progress is being made and things are changing for the better. Because if you just keep that to yourself and don't communicate and provide feedback to the team, they're going to see that the likelihood of actual real change happening is slim to none.
Absolutely. So now let's kind of transition to operational leading indicators. And Max, I'll turn it over to you for this.
Okay. So when we look at operational leading indicators, when I did my first session, I talked about the importance of measurement, right? I think too many companies don't take measurement seriously enough, because people behave in the way they're measured. I think we talked about the Wells Fargo situation where people were committing fraud to meet the goal, right? So it's like, don't underestimate the power of measurement. So we got to have, like Elizabeth was saying, we got to have the right measurements. If we have the wrong measurements, we're going to get the wrong behaviors. We got to have the right measurements, and they got to be aligned. So we have our key measurements, and then we also have the measurements that are supporting measurements. They all got to be aligned. So what is the purpose of measurement? So there's multiple purposes of measurement. So first is to provide judgment on the current state. So how are we doing as an organization? So there's all types of measurements we have that are measuring how we're doing currently in the organization. But in addition, there's how do we induce people to take the action that is aligned with the goals of the organization? So one of the purposes of measurement is making sure that we induce people to take the right action. Again, if we're not taking the right action, we're not going to get the right results. So it's creating those behaviors within the organization. And then also providing immediate feedback on the effectiveness of our decision making. So when we make a decision, the measurement system needs to tell us, was that the correct decision or not? If it wasn't the correct decision, we need to recalibrate. But if we wait too long between when we make the decision and when we feel the effect of that decision, right, then we can't make the connection between the cause and effect of, like, was it the decision that we made that was the problem, or was there some other problem that created us to not meet our goals? But the goal there is to have immediate feedback on the decision that were made to determine if that was the correct decision or not. And so Dr. Goldratt that trained me, he had a statement: tell me how you measure me, I'll tell you how I will behave. So people behave in the way that they're measured. So I don't know if anyone has examples of wrong behaviors that they've seen, and then going back and seeing that the people that are having those behaviors, the measurements, the way that either it's we formally measure them that way, or their perception is that they're measured that way. So a lot of times I see that people are perceiving the way that they're measured, and it's actually not what leadership is measuring them on. It's what their perception of what is they should be doing, and so that we get the wrong behaviors. Anybody have examples of where they've seen measurements and inducing the wrong behaviors, whether formally or perceived measurements?
I have an example, actually. So I worked for an organization once where the leader always said, at every possible chance, oh, we're output based, we're not clock punchers. We don't care how much you're sitting, how many hours you're sitting at your desk in the day. As long as you're doing the work and you're doing the work well, that's what we're focused on. So trying to create that culture of flexibility. Except, there was more than one occasion where him or someone else in the office would say to me, oh, Amanda, I noticed that you weren't in the office at all yesterday. So, did you get the things done that you were supposed to get done? And I was in a position that was dedicated to community outreach, going around meeting with businesses. And so my response is, you don't want me sitting at my desk. If I'm sitting at my desk, that means I'm not out visiting businesses. So it was just that weird, he's saying one thing, but then when I'm getting these questions about, oh, you're not here in the office, how do we know you're working? Well, if I'm in the office, I'm not doing my job. So you shouldn't see me. So it was just this weird, I was very torn, where I felt like I needed to make a physical appearance in the office on a regular basis, which then disrupted my schedule of being out and visiting businesses. So it was just a very strange situation.
Yep, I think that's a perfect example. And then, like you said, it puts you in a conflict, right? So when you get in a conflict, what do? Or it's a conflict of what I should be doing versus what the leadership perceives I should be doing, right?
I was just confused.
All right.
Okay, so now what are key performance indicators? So the key performance indicators are the measurements to provide information on how well the company is achieving its objectives. So we talked in the sessions earlier about, we have the needs of the customer. So we need to understand, are we servicing the customer correctly? And then we also have the needs of the stakeholders. So the stakeholders are the employees in the organization, the leadership, maybe our suppliers, maybe our community. So who are the stakeholders? So we need to understand that we're meeting the needs of both our customers and our stakeholders. So key means it's integral to the success of the organization. So I like to talk about like the vital signs, right? So our vital signs personally are our breathing rate, our temperature, our heart rate, our blood pressure. As long as those are in normal condition, I'm pretty healthy. So it's the same with the organization. There's key indicators we can look at that say, is the organization healthy or not? And if it's not healthy, right, then we need to take action. And so my general rule of thumb is the vital signs or the key performance indicators. There should be no more than 6 key performance indicators. So it's a dashboard. So I went into one company and I go into a meeting and they have a daily meeting. They literally had 6 4x10 whiteboards filled with metrics. I'm like, what is this? They go, oh, we go through these metrics every morning. I'm like, are you kidding me? I think they got mad at me because I said it's a dashboard, not a cockpit. So we don't need hundreds of metrics, right? It's like we need a few key metrics that are measuring the health of the organization and making sure we have immediate feedback on those key metrics, right? We can't wait a month and say, oh, it's like, how did we do last month at the end of the month or 2 weeks into the next month? It's like, I don't know about people on the call, but I can't remember what I did 2 days ago. So I need that immediate feedback. And I like to measure, if we can measure daily, that would be great. Measure weekly, not as good, but it's not that terrible. So some measurements weekly is fine, but waiting quarterly, right, is way too long for me. And so it needs to be a combination of customer focused and internal focused. And we really want to have leading indicators. So what are leading indicators? So we'll talk about leading versus lagging indicators. So most companies I see have lagging indicators. So what's a lagging indicator? It's what happened in the past. So what was our performance last week? What was our performance last month? What was our performance last quarter? And a lot of the financial measures you see are lagging indicators. The problem is we can't affect the measurement when we're looking in the rear view mirror. Okay. So what's a leading indicator? So leading indicator is a predictive measurement that indicates the future success of the organization. So I really like to promote leading indicators versus lagging indicators. Now, leading indicators are extremely difficult to develop. So it's not easy to develop leading indicators. And so the example I like to use here of lagging versus leading is like, think about driving home after work today. How far are you going to get if you look through your rear view mirror driving home? Okay, so that's a lagging indicator. We're looking in the rear view mirror to figure out where we're trying to go as an organization. What we want to do is look through that front windshield, right? So our indicators need to be looking through the front windshield forward, not looking backward. So people on the call would be interested to hear what measurements your company is using as key performance indicators, and are they lagging indicators or leading indicators? Are they looking in the past of what happened, or are they looking to the future of what is, if something's healthy, is it going to be positive impact for the company? So in this case, what's lagging versus leading? So sales revenue. So how much did we sell last month, last quarter, right? Those are lagging indicators, but a leading indicator is what's our backlog. If we have a healthy pipeline, right, and the pipeline's healthy, we're probably going to have good sales revenue the next month. So I like to look at sales backlog and that pipeline to understand what is our health of our pipeline. That's going to be an indicator of future success of the company. So that's just one example of lagging versus leading. But most companies are looking at, oh, what did we sell last quarter? What did we sell last month, right? And then leadership comes down, we need to do better, right? Do better. Okay, and then we want to focus on the desired outcomes. So I've done a lot of work in system thinking, and this Russell Akoff that I watch a lot of his videos, one of the things that he says is you need to focus your measurements on the desired outcomes for the organization. So the measurements should be designed for what you want. They shouldn't be designed for what you don't want. So this was like mind-blowing for me. So what do companies measure in their, it's like one of the things I look at is like, oh, we measure how much scrap we're generating, right? So I do a lot of work with manufacturing companies and they're measuring their scrap rate. And I say, that's what you don't want, right? So why are you measuring scrap rate? And that's a lagging indicator of what you don't want. What you really want is first high pass first pass quality, right? That's the indicator we're looking for. And this lagging indicator of scrap rates, I go into companies and they're measuring scrap. I said, I can take your scrap to 0 right now. Stop producing stuff. Right? That'll meet the goal of 0 scrap. But that's not what the company wants. So now it becomes a misalignment between what the company wants and what we're measuring. So step back and look at your organization and how many measurements do you have are measuring what you don't want. You need to flip those measurements to what you want. And then what's a better measurement of quality? It's like process capability. So process capability, if anyone has a quality background of like CPK, measures the probability that the process is going to perform correctly when you perform the process. It's a forward-looking indicator. So statistical process control is a technique that was developed in the quality arena to indicate when the process starts to deviate, and you take immediate corrective action before the process goes out of control and makes something wrong. And it doesn't matter what the process is. A lot of people think, oh, it's a manufacturing process. No, any process, if you can measure it, you can determine if it's capable or not. And so our goal is to put capable measurements in place as indicators of how the process is performing, and we start to see deviations that cause us to go a little bit out of whack, we take immediate corrective action. So that brings me to my next point of building accountability into the process. So there's this concept of what we call the management window. So the management window is the time between when action's taken until we understand the effect of that action. So I don't care if it's leadership making decisions or somebody in the process making a decision, and then that action that decision we make is going to create an action that's either positive or negative. And so the goal is to reduce the management window. So the time between when an action's taken until we understand the effect of that action. The longer that period goes, the more disruption. If we make a wrong decision and we wait weeks and weeks and weeks to see the effect of that, it's a lot of effort to correct the problem now. So this is the reactive mindset that we get, where we make a decision and then it's weeks later before we understand the effect of that and its negative effects. Now it's reactive mode, and we're reacting to the problems all the time, and we can't get out of that reactive mode of behavior. And so this example I have here is we have different process steps. So we have inputs to the process. We do multiple process. In the first process, we make a decision on taking some action. We wait until we determine the output of that decision, and it might be weeks later, and we find out, oh, that wasn't correct, but that decision was made 3 weeks ago. So now we have this management window that's a 3-week management window. Our goal is to reduce that management window. So what we want to do is, when we make that decision, have immediate feedback in the process on that decision to reduce that management window. Doing just this will reduce the chaos in the company exponentially. Because, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That was a statement by Benjamin Franklin. So what that means is that the amount of effort to correct a problem after it occurs, and the longer time between when the decision was made till that problem really shows up, it's 16x effort. So if we can immediately understand if the decision was correct or not, that effort to correct the problem goes down exponentially. And
I want to point out real quick, Max, that what you're talking about, just to connect the dots for everybody, and why this is so important and why it's so tempting to not do it, is kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, because getting that continuous feedback all the way along, knowing that people aren't going to embrace it right away, knowing they're going to be upset and angry, and knowing the behaviors aren't going to instantaneously align with what you need them to be, it's very tempting not to do what Max is suggesting here. But you can see, because we don't want to deal with it, right? But you can see how exponentially it shrinks that window of time before you see the improvement.
And so that this switch starts the switch of coming from that reactive mode to that proactive mode that we want, right? And then if we have the wrong measurements, right, and we can see the effect of the actions immediately and it's not aligned, right, then we need to recalibrate our measurement system. And I have a couple examples of that. So one company I went into, they wanted to improve their on-time delivery performance. And so we went through, we did some analysis on how we could improve their delivery performance. And when I looked at how they're measuring their on-time delivery, they would measure the on-time delivery. They would take the hit on the late order that they shipped on the week that they shipped it. I'm like, no, you need to take it the week that you miss it. So if I start improving their on-time delivery, shipping all their late orders, their on-time delivery performance is going to go down. And people will be like, what are we doing? We brought this guy in and our delivery performance is going down. I'm like, yes, because we're shipping all the late orders. We want to show that we're improving our on-time delivery. So we take the hit the week that we miss the order. And they're like, oh. So again, that measurement was measuring the wrong, it was the correct measurement in on-time delivery, but it was being measured wrong. And it's like, when people look at that, it's like we're taking all these actions and we're getting worse. No, we're actually getting better, but the measurement's not showing that. I don't know if people have examples where they've seen that, where it's like you got a measurement and it's the correct measurement, but we're not calculating it correctly and it's going the wrong direction. And then people start to like, what are we doing, right? And it goes back to that, what Elizabeth was talking about that anger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm going to turn
So-
it back over to Elizabeth and Amanda on cultural. Is there any questions on what I discussed here or comments?
Awesome. Well, thank you, Max. We appreciate it. And everybody, obviously, as you know, as we've been doing this whole series, please drop any questions, thoughts, or comments in the chat box, or feel free to even unmute yourself. But we're going to talk a little bit now about some of the culture leading indicators, right? And a couple things that I think are really important to make sure everybody understands. Before you can, and Max also talked about this for the operational leading indicators as well. Before you can create any sort of improvement or change, you need to first understand what your starting point is. So in the context of your organizational culture, because again, I want to connect the dots for everybody and weave in what we have talked about from session 1 into 2 and now into 3. All of these things that Max is speaking of, and all these things that undoubtedly those of you who've chosen to spend your time with us, these 3 parts of this webinar series, are desiring in terms of operational excellence, none of it's going to be successful if you don't have, first and foremost, the foundation of the culture that's going to support what it is you're trying to do, right? So you have to understand your starting point, and that is done through a culture survey. Culture surveys are very often mislabeled as engagement surveys. Engagement is just, the level of engagement is just one little nuance as to a clue of what your culture may be like, but there is actually a quantifiable way to measure your culture, something that we have put, and I personally can tell you that I have put decades of research and time and effort and energy and finesse into developing. But you have to go about understanding your starting point for your current state of your culture in a quantifiable manner that is not subjective whatsoever, but instead very objective, broken out by the different respondent groups within your organization. So once you understand what your current state is for your culture in a quantifiable manner, you also from there have to understand, okay, where is it we want to be? What is this vision that we're attempting to fulfill? And then you can understand the gaps that exist. So the actions you need to take in order to get there are going to vary from organization to organization. They're also, Alejandro, going to vary from location to location within the same organization because there are subcultures that exist. So your culture leading indicators are going to be those specific action items that can be tracked to make sure that you close the gaps that exist. But what those exact gaps are going to vary based upon what's revealed in your culture survey. And Amanda, I'd like to actually open it up to you to give an example from the work that we've done together of action items that you've seen that can be tracked or measured.
Sure. So one of the most, I would say, most common things that we hear when we do a culture survey with a client, communication is probably one of the ones that comes through most frequently, is that employees feel like they don't know what's happening within the business, day to day or big picture. And so we work with the organizations to identify how can we communicate more effectively with your team. And that's being conscientious of the fact that not everyone communicates the same way, not everyone receives information the same way, understands information the same way. So it's going through an exercise of making sure that you are providing more than one method. And so when we're looking at, quantity of the messaging that's going out, saying, oh, I sent an email, or, oh, I put it up on a message board in the break room, okay, well, that's good. That's a step in the right direction, but we need to add more to that. So we're making sure we're being inclusive of everyone and how they like to receive information and how they process it. So that's just one really simple example. But looking at, making sure you are taking into consideration the fact that what you're doing is a starting point, and building on that is the way to go.
Excellent. So if you go to the next slide, the next slide is actually, that's a little bit redundant. I'm sorry, the one after this. The next slide gives you examples of culture leading indicators. And, once again, I think it's very important, I know it's very important for you to understand that you must have those capable measurements, like Max spoke about, in order to understand how the process is going. And you have to build accountability into that process. So doing a culture survey to understand your current state is not the only thing you do. From there, you have to figure out exactly what you want to focus on to close those gaps, whatever gaps are revealed. And to Max's earlier point, you don't want to try to boil the ocean and have a cockpit of of measurements and KPIs, but instead you want to take a look at all your results from your culture survey, and you want to cherry pick, let's say, the 5 to 6 that are the lowest hanging fruit that will have the broadest impact to close the most gaps. And you want to build accountability by having, first of all, sharing transparently the results of the survey, the good, the bad, and the ugly, including project groups and a cultural implementation team to really have a focused effort in addressing those issues. And by the way, those groups, that cultural implementation group, to work on those areas that emerge from your culture survey, ought not just be leaders in the organization. In fact, it should be cross-functional, people representing different layers within the organization, because it's everybody's culture. And you want to apply accountability. So you want to meet at a regular cadence to really chisel away at those. Again, we have a very simplified process that we recommend to the people that we work with, but that process builds in weekly measurements, just like Max said, of accountability. And then that all leads into quarterly pulse surveys to see exactly how the progress is aligning and the results are aligning with the progress, I should say, that's been put into it. So examples are applying your organizational values with intention, making sure that, there's behavioral based coaching for those who don't live your values. So often we see clients, believe that they're coaching their employees or their leaders, or they pay a hefty sum of money to hire someone to do coaching, but really it's not behavioral based. Any coaching, in order for it to be successful, has to have an inside out approach. Otherwise, it's just telling, right? So making sure that there are check-in sessions to ensure progress is being made from what you're investing in coaching, making sure that, you know, the training that you invest in is really driving the behaviors that address your existing gaps. But I'm going to add one more thing you don't see here. It's also holding the leadership accountable, the senior most leadership accountable, to ensure that they are creating the culture to sustain the behaviors that you are putting people through training to bring back to the organization to address the existing gaps. There's not a bigger waste of money than investing money to train people, thinking that's going to be the magic pill, only for those people who are coming back energized and excited to implement what they've learned to have their hands slapped, right? So it's not only investing in that training, but also accountabilities to the leaders to make sure that they are living and creating a culture that is conducive to those behaviors existing. Checking in regularly with people throughout the process of change. And of course, developing team norms, taking the time to do that, and not just ensuring they're consistently modeled, but ensuring they're consistently followed and reinforced. Don't accept anything less. And I'm going to put Amanda on the spot. Amanda, what are some team norms that exist on our team here that are non-negotiables?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost is consistent communication. And that's something that I noticed from day one when I started. Because we're a consulting firm and we're all working on different projects at different times, it's really easy in an environment like that for the communication to fall apart. And yet for DA, it doesn't. Elizabeth is in constant communication with the owner of our firm, Erin, who's in constant communication with me. Elizabeth's also in constant communication with me. So there's never a point where anybody on our team feels like, I don't know what's going on. We have, staff meetings every Monday, of course, but then we're communicating constantly throughout the week. And so initially, I think when I started, it took a little adjustment to get used to the volume of email that flies around for our organization, but I really learned to appreciate it because it keeps me in the loop. Supporting each other is another area. That's one thing that's a non-negotiable. We know that if somebody in the organization is working on a project, we're going to take time as a group to, especially if they're encountering some kind of roadblock, we're going to take time as a group to discuss that and figure out a path forward. What else? I'm trying to think here. I think those are probably questioning. Yep, that's another big one. And something that we do as a group, even if there are people in the organization that aren't working on a particular project, we bring, okay, here's the project, here's the situation, here's what I view as the path forward. What does everybody think? Poke holes in this. Tell me what you think, push back. And there's and questioning the way that we do things as well, our processes. Are there ways that we can be doing this better to serve our clients more efficiently and more effectively, or looking at even just small changes we can make to our process to make the end result better for our clients.
And that answer in terms of those team norms, that should roll off the tongue of the people within your organization. If you were to put the people on your team on the spot without any rehearsal, without any preparation, and ask them what the team norms are that are consistently modeled, followed, and reinforced, and nothing less is accepted, I'm curious, and this might be an interesting exercise. I'm curious if you sat down with each of them, if you would get consistent answers. The answers that are consistent are the team norms that exist. They might not be the ones that you think exist. So that is a very interesting and useful exercise. We're going to get prepared to kind of wrap things up, but Amanda, I want you to talk a little bit for a couple of minutes here before we then turn it over to all of you. We're going to ask for some input from all of you, but talk a little bit about why, nobody can do this alone.
Sure. So as we know, any change, it takes a village, right? This can never be one person or one department's responsibility. And Elizabeth and I see this with the culture all the time. is that some folks in the organization are very quick to point the finger at human resources. Oh, this is culture related. This is HR's job. We don't have any ownership of this. This is their responsibility. Well, no, it's everybody's responsibility because everybody contributes to the culture. So helping to improve the culture is also everyone's responsibility. And that shift is really going to happen only when you have a few things in place. So first of all, culture especially, comes from the top down. So the business leaders have to see it as their responsibility. They have to take a lot of ownership in the process and be extremely involved in these changes. And this is something we talked about with Max too when we were planning this series is, how many times do you come into an organization and you're talking about the changes that need to be made and you're looking around the room and there are not members of the leadership team represented. And it's like, why aren't they here? This is their initiative just as much, if not more so, than it is everybody else's. So making sure that they have some ownership in the process, they're taking ownership and they're actively involved in the process. That using the right resources and partners to help you achieve it. As we talked about last week, doing the culture survey for us, especially, one reason why we recommend that organizations use a third party, even if it's not us, is so employees feel more comfortable being 100% open and honest about their experiences. If they're getting any sort of inkling about, they're going to be able to tie this information back to me somehow, they're not going to be open and honest. So you're not going to get a clear picture of what your culture is. So partnering with that external resource, somebody who can provide an unbiased perspective, really, really valuable as you go through this process. Also accountability. You've heard it many times throughout this session, throughout the previous two sessions, having somebody who can help walk alongside you through this process. Because especially as leaders, some of these processes are extremely difficult to go through. And there's a lot of emotion, especially, if you're the owner or the founder of a business, this is something you built yourself, and now things are changing drastically. That can be really difficult to process. So making sure you have somebody to walk alongside you, to hold you accountable to making those changes, but also to help you process the things that are difficult and help you move forward. That's incredibly valuable as well. Anything to add, Elizabeth or Max?
No, I think you did a good job summing it up. What I would like to now ask everybody, as we tie things up, and before you hop off, and first of all, thank you so much for everybody that joined us, whether you are joining us and looking at this as a recording because you couldn't join us live, or whether you chose to join us live for 1, 2, or 3 of the sessions. Thank you for choosing to focus on the topics that we are talking about throughout this series, because it takes leaders like you to really make a difference in the organization. The $1 million question: what is it that stands out the most to you from this series? And then what is one thing you'll do differently as a result? So we'd love it if you could drop your comment in the chat box, unmute yourself, cherry
Actually, I
pick
have
what
a
you want
poll
to answer.
too that I'm going to put up on the screen. Yes.
Let's do
So
that.
there's a few different questions here. Just a couple of quick questions about how you heard about the series, how well the content met your expectations, but then we want to understand what's one thing that you're going to do differently as a result of what you've learned. And of course, we always want to know what we can be doing to make things better for you as you attend our educational opportunities. Some of you have joined us for webinar series in the past. So let us know. We want to know, what are some things we could have done to make the series better? So if you could, we would love it if you would just take a minute and respond to these questions, please. This information is incredibly helpful to us as we prepare for future sessions. And if you have any more detailed information you'd like to provide and you want to drop that in the chat box, you're welcome to do that as well. Or if you want to unmute and share it verbally, we would love for you to do that too.
And I have a question while people are filling out the survey, maybe for Elizabeth. So I go into a lot of different companies, and I can go into 2 companies that are same markets, and one company can make change at lightning speed. Another company I work with, they call it glacial speed.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at the 2 companies, the one company has most of the employees at the glacial speed are 25 years plus in the company, but a company that I see with the younger longevity, the rate that he can make change is exponentially faster. I don't know if you guys have had any experience with like longevity in companies and what the effect of that is on culture. Have you seen that?
Personally speaking, I honestly don't, I don't think it has to do with longevity at the company. I truly think it does boil down to the mindset of the people or the person at the very, very top.
Okay. Okay.
And their willingness to be transparent and honest with themselves.
Okay.
That's what I think it boils down to. And that's why, we take very seriously who it is that we choose to work with and who it is that we don't, because if they're not ready, then the efforts, we don't want to take their money, right? We don't want to waste their time because it's not
Yep.
going to be successful.
Chris shared in the chat, the thing that's sticking with me from today is the idea that every change is a loss and to be sensitive to the grief process. I completely agree. That's actually one of my favorite takeaways from today's session too. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but that's one of my favorite takeaways as well. I think that's a great way to look at how change can be processed in the organization.
Excellent. Amanda, anything else to wrap up?
Just a couple of quick things. So as always, we want to share our contact information with you all. So if you'd like to continue the conversation, if you have any questions for us after the fact, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help you, to support you as you go through these operational and cultural changes in your organizations and help your team to process those as well. Additionally, just some information for Max here. If you'd like to connect with him on LinkedIn, check out their website or their YouTube channel, you can do so by going to any of these links. And I'll leave that up here for just a second. And then I also want to share our information as well. So we have our LinkedIn, our Facebook, our website. If you scan that QR code, that will take you to our services page on our website, an opportunity to visit our LinkedIn page, as well as sign up for our email newsletter called Decision Point. It goes out quarterly, lots of great resources in that. So thank you to those of you who have taken the time to fill out the survey. I'm going to leave that up for just a few minutes here while we wrap. But thanks to all those who attended one session, 2 sessions, 3 sessions, those who are watching this as a recording. We will be sending out the follow-up email today, a little bit later this afternoon. So keep an eye out for that. We'll be sending you some video content in that as well, talking about some of the services that we outlined in our respective presentations last week and the week prior. From folks who have actually gone through those processes with us. And so they're going to share with you their thoughts on that. So keep an eye out for that. And as always, if you have any questions or need help with anything, please don't hesitate to reach out.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for choosing to spend time with us and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.